Now, we're gonna just move to the next and last speaker, Massimiliano Castelli, and I believe he will provide us information, economic information, of course, but from a more finance side. Massimiliano Castelli, thank you very much for joining us here. Please have it to speak now.
Thank you very much, and I hope you can hear me and see me well. You will forgive me if I am rejected, because I was actually rejected a few times and I have to reconnect. So if that happens, please bear with me, because I will reconnect very quickly. First of all, I would like to thank the organizer for the kind invitation, and of course apologize as well myself for not being in Baku. Actually, it was quite a while ago, before the pandemic, that I was in that beautiful city. I travel regularly to Baku at least twice a year, because as UBS we have the pleasure of working in partnership with some important institution in your country, and it happens very often for me to visit that country. So say that, what I would like to do in the next 15 minutes is just to maybe go a little bit deeper on the sort of a macro and the structural trends that we are seeing at a global level, and try to extrapolate from that some strategic implication for Azerbaijan as it prepares for the post-pandemic era. Let me first of all start by sharing a slide, which is a survey that I carry out, my team carry out in June of this year. So this was actually at the peak, if you want, of the previous wave of the pandemic. And we ask basically to an institution from all around the world, what are your major concerns with regards to the global economy? And actually, not surprising, 80%, so the top concern remain, and it was at the time, and I believe it would be the same now, even more, that we have a new variant hitting us, that the failure to control the pandemic. What I think, however, is more interesting is what are the concerns which are in second and third position. First of all is about the government debt level. That's something that you heard from the previous speaker, that the reaction of government to the pandemic has been to inject an unprecedented amount of expenditure, of fiscal expenditure into the economy, or directly into the pockets of individuals or in the balance sheet of companies. And of course, this has ballooned the deficit, the debt level of countries. That's something that so far has not been really discussed very much, in the sense that we are still dealing with an emergency. I guess that's what happened when you are still in an emergency. You think about, first of all, to extinguish the fire, and then you think about repairing the damage a little bit later. So I'm not surprised about that. But just to mention that this, at least from an institutional investor perspective, is a source of concern. The other one is about inflation. And now this is interesting, because we ask this survey every year. Believe me, inflation until this year was not mentioned by anyone as a concern. Actually, the major concern in the past used to be deflation and the problem of not being able to hit the inflation target which central banks have. So that's definitely a new debt and inflation are two new reasons of concern at the global level, which were not present at all in previous years. This is a very important factor, because I believe that once this pandemic will be behind us, will become prominent. Actually, inflation already is, and I think that will also be a very important topic of conversation among the policymakers. Now, then if you look at the other factors, I think we have exactly what you would expect, the geopolitical issues. The main one, of course, is the China-US relationship and eventual escalation in that confrontation. And the fourth one, which was already mentioned by some of the previous speakers, by Mr. Solzhenitsyn, actually was climate change and all the potential implication that this will have on the global economy going forward. Now, these are, in a nutshell, what comes out of this survey is that there are some important change occurring as a result of the pandemic, which in the end will remain there once the health emergency is over. So before I go back to these sort of more long-term issues, which I believe are very important for any country looking at how to position itself competitively in the global economy going forward, let me just mention very quickly what happened. And I will be relatively brief here because my previous speaker already mentioned some of the factors which are very important. First of all is that it's true we are in the middle of a new wave. We have a new variant which is still obscure in terms of potential real implication going forward. But for sure there is a fact, the recovery is strong. The recovery is ongoing. We see expansion across both the manufacturing sector, but more importantly, more in the service sector, which of course was the one which was impacted very heavily during the lockdown. So what happened is very simple. As the lockdown were introduced around the world and social mobility dropped, the people, at least those who continue receiving an income or who receive additional income via transfer from the government, have been largely spending time on buying goods, durable goods. And in fact, we have seen a very big demand increase in the manufacturing sector, which has actually come probably even stronger than what we were expecting during the pandemic. Now, this effect is very important because this has been what ultimately has also driven up inflation. Because, of course, with a sudden increase of pent-up demand into sectors which have a limited production capacity, we saw prices soaring in a specific sector. We saw bottleneck emerging on the supply side. We saw as well, very important for a country like Azerbaijan, the rise in oil price as well. Now, that's a little bit, then in the second wave, when social lockdowns, when social mobility is starting to resume in terms of intensity and going back gradually to the pre-pandemic level, to the pre-lockdown level, actually we are seeing that the demand is gradually shifting from the manufacturing sector towards the service sector. Now, this is a very important dynamic because you will hear from me, I am a banker, you will hear from the majority of the financial service industry, but I believe as well from central banker, and I'm talking about the central banks who dictate the monetary policy, so the Fed, the ECB, and other central banks in the developed world, that the current increase in inflation is transitory. And this view about the transitory increase in inflation is largely due to what I told you before, that the social mobility restriction have created an imbalance between demand and supply, which eventually, through time, will be reabsorbed and will bring back the inflation towards the target of around 2.5%, which is what is considered as sustainable over the long term. Now, of course, if this is going to be the case, I believe remains to be seen. I am personally as well in the camp of those who believe that there is no real scenario of stagflation, in the sense that in order to have a scenario of stagflation, we should see some important development, for instance, in the labor market. But say that there is some important difference across countries. For instance, we are starting to see some interesting developments in the labor market in the US, where actually the participation rate appears to be dropped during the pandemic and is not coming back. Some I believe it was even as well McKinsey that were talking about the great resignation. And I think that overall this, of course, points to potential bottlenecks in the labor market, which could eventually have an impact if of course, start pushing up wages. I believe this is mainly a future in the US, but that's definitely a factor to watch as we move into the post-pandemic world. Now, one factor which for banks and in general for investors is very important is that, seen from an historical perspective, the level of interest rate remain incredibly low. Yes, it is true that eventually the central banks will be forced maybe to hike rates a little bit earlier than what was forecasted just a few quarters ago, for instance, the Fed in the course of 2022. It is true that there is some pressure on central banks to start reducing their buying of bonds in the open market, so the so-called quantitative easing. But if you look at overall the monetary policy stance that we have across the major economies, and I'm talking about mainly developed market economies, it is still very, very, very loose. And this is, of course, very, very important because this guarantees that there is an ample level of liquidity which supports the economy and continues supporting the economy. That's a very important element. Now, what about emerging markets? I mean, emerging markets, it is very important because emerging markets came into this crisis in a position of strength, particularly when you think about Asia. Asia was the one which were able to control the pandemic better than anybody else. They had a very low level of contagion. They were able to impose a very strict social measure. The level of mortality was very low. Overall, China was very successful as well, and it is indeed. But what actually made a difference, what has made a difference over the course of 2021, it is the level of vaccination rate across developed market and emerging economies. Now, you see here the difference between emerging markets which are in red, excluding China. China, as you know, is also vaccinated at a very rapid pace. And you also see that most of the Western world is around well above 50%, 60%, and in some cases also closer to 80%. Now, what's very important to keep in mind is that emerging markets are catching up very quickly. That's also, of course, a result of the fact that vaccines are becoming more widely available across more jurisdictions. And I think that's also, we think that ultimately emerging markets will eventually catch up in terms of economic performance. Some of them are already catching up pretty strongly, particularly the commodity-based one, because of course the rise in commodity price in oil, but also in other commodities, which we experienced in 2021, has been pretty robust, and it is of course helping a lot some of these economies to recoup very quickly what they lost during the pandemic. So let me stop here about the sort of more economic outlook perspective by saying that we have a very strong economic recovery in place. We have definitely an improvement in the situation. Yes, it's true, we are still seeing the pandemic hitting, and there is of course a question mark about the variante, but if this variante will not be a game changer, it is reasonable to assume that the level of social mobility will remain relatively good as we move in 2022, and this recovery can continue as the expansion moves from the manufacturing sector to the service sector, which ultimately represent the bulk of the majority of the economies. Now, of course, there are risk factors out there. One of them for sure is inflation, but also if I look at the perspective from an emerging market point of view, actually, if you think about it, the recent announcement made by the Fed about a reduction in their purchase of bonds in the open market, the so-called taper tantrum, has actually had a relatively limited impact on emerging market. Last but not least, let me mention that I operate a lot within emerging market. Emerging markets have been very reactive in increasing interest rate in the face of the rise in inflation, probably on the back of the fact that emerging markets are more weak in general from a macroeconomic perspective, and they want to take preventive measure. They're not prepared to take the gamble of seeing whether the inflation is temporary or not. They simply start hiking rates, and we saw that across the board from Russia to Brazil to over several economies, for instance, in Central and Eastern Europe. Now, if I move down to the question which I believe it is more important, so which is about the long term, because I think ultimately what I think will determine the success or fail, or let's say the winner and the loser in the post-pandemic world, will be how countries will focus on those factors of competitiveness which we think will drive growth in the future. So if I look at the way that what are the sort of big trends, the secular trends that are reshaping the global economy, some of them have already been mentioned, but let me just go a little bit more in detail on that. First of all, I mentioned to you that it's going to be a world which is more in depth. That's very important to keep in mind, because this will create some issues. It will create some debate about how to put under control the fiscal situation of countries. Let me also mention that, for instance, in the case of Azerbaijan, which correctly has expanded its fiscal policy, has suspended the fiscal rule during the pandemic, eventually will be very important as well to eventually go back to a sustainable fiscal path, because of course on that depends macroeconomic stability. But there will also be countries which will not be able or will not succeed in doing that. And these are countries which will fail on the macroeconomic stability level, which of course it is the sort of condition sine qua non for having an healthy growth in any country. That's very important to keep in mind, because that will determine as well who is going to do well, who is not going to do well in terms of growth going forward. Now, the second factor that I think it is already been mentioned, and I'm really glad about my Italian fellow panelists talking about digitization. I found this presentation incredibly interesting. I think what, if I can, I hope Gianvito will forgive me if I say that what he said is very important. Digitization is in front of us everywhere. It is from our online shopping to the way we use money, digital currency, everything is happening. But there is still a lot of, it's not clear how all these trends are going to impact different countries, different sectors, and different corporates. So this is something which is going to be very, very important going forward to understand. But what is certain is that we are at the beginning, I believe, of a major trend which has the potential to reshape many sectors. And I will mention one of them, which of course is more closer to my knowledge and to my heart, which is the digitization that we are witnessing in the financial service industry. Now, another important element that has not been mentioned, but that I would like to mention, is about the inequality. This is something which I think it is also very important to keep in mind for two reasons. First of all, for an ethical reason, the loser needs to be bailed out. We learned that through the pandemic, and they cannot be left behind, for a simple reason that if that happens, ultimately this will have a very strong political repercussion. But that's not all the whole story. There is also an economic dimension to inequality, which we believe it is also the source of some important distortion. Just think about, for instance, the growing empirical evidence which has been released by academics around the world for the role that inequality in the concentration of wealth is having, for instance, on the level of interest rates. So there is something that also central banks are starting to consider in their monetary policy framework. Then let me mention something which has been mentioned, and I'm very glad about Professor Kolodko's comments on globalization, which has been made. I remember about 2 years ago, I published a paper together with a colleague from, an academic from IMD about globalization. And definitely the feeling is that we are entering a period of slowdown in globalization. And according to some, we are going to see even a reversal. Now, how does this match the sort of massive rise in international trade, in shipping goods being moving across ships in the world? Containers are at the max, and actually we're seeing bottleneck emerging in ports. I believe that the story about globalization or deglobalization is going to be a little bit more complicated than simply a drop into sort of a reversal, for instance, in the growth of international trades or in terms of global capital flow, including foreign direct investment, maybe even immigration, which of course has been impacted very heavily from the pandemic already. But that's something that I think is very important to keep in mind, because I believe that one potential important implication of this new phase of globalization will be about risk diversification in international value chain. So basically the idea that being reliant only on China for the production of your semi-industrial goods, it is a risky business, because who knows how things will develop, for instance, in the confrontation between US and China, with protectionism always potentially there being used as a political tool in this geopolitical competition, which will remain a feature of our life, at least for the foreseeable future. So from that point of view, I believe this also opens some opportunities for countries which are able to attract maybe some investment which are being directed at different countries. We're already seeing that strategy being deployed by some countries. Example, Vietnam. Example, Mexico, which is offering the US, well, you want to be less dependent on China? Well, you can come and invest here, just across the border. And that's, of course, something that they are looking very closely by adopting strategy clearly focused on that. Then there is a fifth one, which is about sustainability. Now, sustainability has been mentioned by my previous speaker. I believe I am a little bit more sanguine about sustainability, because we believe that sustainability is a transformational trend. It is, of course, we can debate about the speed and the timing of this transition. It can be longer or shorter. I think it depends on a lot of variables, including to what extent the weather event will become more extreme relatively quickly rather than later, or whether politicians ultimately will respond to the demand coming from people and citizens around the world and will accelerate and take more courageous measures in terms of really moving the world away from carbon type of fuel. But that's for us a trend which is there. And I think for a country like Azerbaijan, like for any other country which is oil commodity based, it should eventually be taken very seriously, because ultimately this could be the trend that will determine success or failure going forward. And I think it is very wise to eventually already think strategically about this. So let me, I got maybe a few minutes left. I would like to talk about two things. First of all, globalization. Now, this is a very interesting topic, because until a while ago, I was pretty convinced that the world was moving towards a multipolar system. As protectionism and barriers are raised across from China versus the US and vice versa, I could see the world shifting to three main blocks. The America centered around the US dollar, the EU, of course, the Europe centered around the euro, and of course the Asian centered around China and the RMB. And actually we are starting to see already a little bit of that. At least if I look at it from a financial perspective, from an investment perspective, the more I talk to clients who invest, who have a global portfolio, they tend to really have the US, the Euro area, Europe, and China, and then the others. And I think that's something very, very important, because that's a new development. This is we are starting to see, for instance, investors taking China out of the emerging market universe, because China is so big in terms of both this fixed income market and in terms of its equity market, that ultimately makes sense to have China as a separate allocation in your global portfolio. This is something very remarkable, because it means that really the world is moving towards this multipolar system. Now, this was my conviction until a while ago, and I can see all the different sort of, if you want, the different ingredients supporting that view. We were seeing much more inward looking from different countries. China protecting certain sector, the US and Europe focus on strategic sector, think about health sector, semiconductors, what sometimes they are labeled as a strategic asset from an industrial perspective. And then, of course, there was the policy drive, protectionism from the US towards China, Europe as well, creating more control at this border. But overall, I think that there is a factor which could in some way change the cards and change this shift towards the three main blocks, which is technology and digitization. Because it is true, as Gianvito said, that ultimately it is not enough to become digital to be successful. You need to support that digitization with a very solid institutional framework. But the point is that a country with a very solid institutional framework, but relatively small, both in terms of its economy, in terms of its population, and in terms of the weight that it can have in the global economy, before digitization did not have any chance in some way to emerge or to really come out as a potential competitor with the largest economy. What if instead the digitization can change that level of competition? I give an example, which I think it is a fair example, which is about the digital currency. We are seeing an amazing acceleration in central banks' activity around central banks' digital currency. It is clearly foreseeable that over the next 5 years, and maybe a little bit more depending on the speed, but I believe we're not talking about something very, very distant in time, we are going to see digital currency replacing a fiat currency. Now, this is very, very important, because the rise of digital currency, supported by a solid institutional and macro framework, can make a currency which before did not have any chance to succeed to eventually become very attractive. And this is very important, because this means that those countries which will be able to embrace digitization, to be and support this process, with a solid economic, macroeconomic, fiscal and monetary policy framework, and the right investment in infrastructure and human capital, has the potential to thrive in this new global digital world. And I think that that's something that should be part of any blueprint of a strategic plan of a country moving into the post-pandemic world. I would like to end with a question which, as I mentioned, is very important for Azerbaijan. I always find myself in conversation with commodity-based sovereign wealth funds. I know very well Azerbaijan. I'm very familiar with all the commodity-based sovereign wealth funds across the Gulf. And I believe that, we are part of the One Planet initiative, which is the most emblematic initiative of sovereign wealth funds really focusing on climate change and eventually to incorporate climate change in their investment framework. And I believe, and here we have some of the big guys from the Gulf, the Saudi, the UAE, ADIA, or the KIA from Kuwait. These are the most well-established sovereign wealth funds. So what happened with climate change? What is the story? Should the role of this sovereign wealth fund change? Well, I believe that sovereign wealth funds in the post-pandemic world, the more digital and green type of world that we are moving in, will have to play a even more important strategic role. In the sense that the sovereign wealth funds have been fundamentally created to diversify accumulated oil revenues in global market, to maximize the return on that wealth, and eventually to transmit part of the wealth to future generations. Now, as we move into an energy transition type of world, which of course will take a while to materialize, but I believe it will continue, sovereign wealth funds will have to play an additional role. They will have, first of all, be part of the strategic shift of any country's oil-based country to diversify its economy away from oil. Very often, sovereign wealth funds have the most sophisticated personnel. They know very well financial market. They can handle strategic investment, sometimes better than other entity in the country. But secondly, they will also have a very big responsibility down the road from a fiscal perspective, should the government eventually, in a world where revenues will fall, start to eventually needing some funds. So on that level, let me also add that the sovereign wealth funds can also play a very important role as far as green technology is involved. Why not sovereign wealth funds in an oil exporting economy should not invest, for instance, much more heavily in carbon capture or any green technology, which in the end will be a very important part of the energy transition going forward. I believe that all these strategic choices should start to be considered relatively quickly, relatively sooner rather than later, because it is true that some of these trends will take years to unfold, but ultimately those who prepare now and will lay the ground for being competitive in 10 years' time, I believe will ultimately succeed. With that, I stop here. Thank you very much.